Hey guys, welcome to my channel. This is the Encourager Queen C No Longer Bound, right here with a 4-part series by Dr. Claude Anderson on his PowerNomics, teaching about Black history and giving us some survival tactics on what we need to do to get through even to today. Now this video was done a few years ago, but the words that he speaks, they really apply to today. Make sure you watch, make sure you like, make sure you share, and make sure you subscribe. And we will see you next time.
Rather than going back and saying, let's find out what has happened to black folk for 460 years. Have they been psychologically, emotionally, politically, educationally damaged? Nobody spent 1 minute of time trying to figure out what had happened to black folk over all that period of time. So in the course of the civil rights movement, at the end of it, they say, well, let's pretend that nothing has happened to them, that they were not injured, they were not hurt. And now let's go seek integration and pretend that we're all equal. Now that was grossly unfair, because by that point in time, in about the 1966 period, whites had become economic giants in America. They owned and controlled everything at that point in time. Black folk didn't own anything. Whites controlled almost 100% of all the wealth, the income, the privileges, the businesses, the resources, and all levels of government. Blacks had nothing. Blacks were 1-foot midgets. And they allowed us then to use integration to walk from our communities, from our ghettos over in their communities, totally disarmed, not understanding anything, blind, naked, and then saying you go and compete. Compete with what? And that's what's happening in South Africa right now, where you have black folk now who have been totally subjected to the most brutal form of legal and economic slavery around the world for almost 300 years in South Africa, where whites in South Africa control almost 100% of all the gold mines, the diamond mines, the chrome, the bauxite, the magnesium, the land, the businesses, the farms, the animals. And now in South Africa, they've been told that they're free. Now, anybody in his right mind would have said, hold it a second. Now, if there's been a reform in South Africa, since whites have gotten everything and blacks got nothing, you should have seen on the news a massive flux of whites trying to get out of South Africa. If there's going to be any significant real change, wouldn't you agree? Somebody would have been trying to get out of there. The airports would have been jammed. And you all haven't heard a peep. You know why? Because nothing is changing. Because in South Africa, the dominant, arrogant white society that's been so brutal to black folks still owns and controls 100% of all the gold mines, diamond mines, silver mines, chrome, bauxite. And they're telling those South Africans, you can now compete. And that's the problem in black America. We've been told now that we can compete, and I say, well, with what? And by going into our underclass structure, going to be 7 converging factors going to push us. To get my little summary up. 1, we're going to have an increased amount of conservatism in the country, and I'm going to talk about conservatism in a few minutes. 2, we're going to have a massive, unending influx of immigrants into the country. They're going to push us down. We have been the number 2 population in America now for over 460 years. We're going to get kicked out of being number 2 and going down to number 3. When are we going to go down to number 3? We're going to go down to number 3 in less than 2 years. Now, when I wrote my book about 4 or 5 years ago, Hispanics at that time were 9% of the population. They've now moved in 6 years from 9% up to 11%. Blacks were 12.3% 6 years ago. They're still at 12.3%. Now you got the Hispanics at 11 and blacks at 12.3. According to the Census Bureau 2 weeks ago in Washington, D.C., they anticipate Hispanics passing blacks right on time, as I had predicted. Now, Wall Street Journal, the left-hand column 2 weeks ago, on the left-hand side of the page, I can send it to you if you want, it says that when Hispanics pass black people, at that time, the whole political structure will shift gears. There'll be a power shift in America. That nobody's going to go to black folk to ask them anything anymore, because you're no longer the dominant minority population. They're already preparing for this. They're already creating all kinds of major programs around the country where they would go and check with Hispanics about anything they want to know about minorities. Black folk would get their information through the Hispanic Society. Then by the year 2005, the Asians are going to pass black folk. Then you're going to get kicked from being number 3 down to number 4. At that point in time, you're locked in and frozen, because everything you need will have to pass through those 2 groups. And those 2 groups do not have your interests at heart, They don't understand your problems and don't care about it. If you can't compete, they're going to say that's tough. And so what we're going to try to do today in dealing with just that one issue, as well as conservatism and the problems of technology in America that's also going to make us push us in the underclass, is to teach you how to compete. We got to understand we got these problems, but you got to understand where the problems came from. And I want to give you a real fast education today, because the real clue to liberation is not only education, it's re-education. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. I'm going to show you how we got into our dilemma and how we must get out of it. Nothing has happened to black folk by accident. Everything that's happened to you has been systematically programmed through what I call social engineering. You are a victim of historical social engineering. Now let's go back and start dealing with some of these issues. And a lot of this would you also find covered in my book, Black Labor, White Wealth, and the other two books I got coming out this year. One is called Dirty Little Secrets, and the big one is called PowerNomics. How do you do it? And PowerNomics, if you want to know what PowerNomics is, because I'm going to talk about it a little later, PowerNomics is teaching my people how a new way of seeing, thinking, and behaving. And that's what the whole thing will be about this morning. You got to change the way you're seeing and thinking and behaving. Why? Because I said we've been locked into an underclass structure, because we got two major problems in America. One problem is that maldistribution of wealth and resources that I told you about that's in South Africa and America, where whites own and control everything. That's your number one problem. The second problem we're going to talk about this morning is the inappropriate behavior pattern of black folk. Those are the only two problems you have. I don't care what anybody else talks about in America. It's not worthwhile wasting your time. The problem in America is not drug abuse, crime, low-income housing, public housing, food stamps, welfare, teenage pregnancy. Those are symptoms of a problem. The symptoms are the fact that you don't own and control anything to run you and control your lives. That's the problem. And the second thing is inappropriate behavior pattern. And before I get into inappropriate behavior patterns, let me define that for you. Now, in current day terms, I might call it the Rodney King syndrome. That's pretty familiar to most of you. That's when somebody pulls you out of a car, breaks your jaw, breaks 3 ribs, cracks 2, knocks out 2 teeth, gives you a concussion, breaks your wrist, breaks your kneecap, and stomps you, and you say, why can't we all get along? That is inappropriate behavior. Or if I'm in Detroit, Michigan, when I was there functioning as an assistant police commissioner during the riots, and I was working on riot possibilities and techniques in the city, I get a call down by some people who had been involved in a couple of murders. And he said, look, I didn't have anything to do with it, Anderson. I just there, I witnessed it. I said, what happened? Well, you see, they'd had a disturbance in Detroit, Michigan, and the police broke into a motel and found 2 black boys in there with some white girls. And they didn't like that, even though they were in a black neighborhood. They had paid for the room. It was their right and privilege to be wherever they wanted to be. It was between them and God. But the police officers were white. They were very disturbed about this. So what they did, they took those 2 boys on a Friday. They beat them all day Friday. They beat them all day Saturday. Then by Sunday, they had gotten tired of beating them. They said, well, we just go ahead and kill them. And so one of the officers picked up a rifle, and hit the oldest black kid in the back of the head with a rifle. The kid was only about 22 years of age. Hit him so hard that it knocked one eye completely out of socket and bulged the other eye and broke the rifle stock. And the poor kid fell on his knees and crawled around and found the broken stock of the rifle, and on his knees held it up and apologized for having a hard head. That is inappropriate behavior. The question should have been, why are you brutalizing me and killing me? What have I done to you? And so that's kind of inappropriate behavior. It's what we've been systematically programming to displaying as black folk in a very highly competitive society. So what I want you all to start thinking about today and all throughout my speech today is not who you're against, but who you're for. I want you to understand that you're in a very highly competitive situation. You're going to be competing to survive and prosper. And that's what racism is all about. Contrary to what anybody tells you, and I just saw a definition of racism in the Washington Post last week by a noted columnist who's a conservative. And what he was really talking about was prejudice and discrimination. He wasn't talking about racism, but he was mystifying the word. That's why I finally figured out why he's always on the wrong side of the issue relating to black folk. He thinks that a black person can be racist. A black person cannot be a racist. Racism is a power relationship between groups of people. That's all it is. It means where one group of people have control of so much wealth and power and resource that it can deprive, hurt, and injure and exploit another group to benefit itself. Never in the history of this earth have black folk ever controlled that much resources and where they can have gone out of their way to exploit, injure, and do something to whites. So therefore, racism only started in the 16th century when you began to commercialize slavery against blacks. That's when racism started. There was no such thing as racism before that. The other thing, and before I get into my presentation, you got to understand racism also comes from the word race. Race means group. So whenever you hear people talking about now, you cannot prove racism because somebody fired you from a job, they are absolutely right. And the power structure and all the white think tanks in Washington know that. That's why you can no longer prove racism, because racism does not apply to an individual. It applies to a group. And because I discriminate against you, that's individual, that's personal. It's not group-based, and so you can no longer prove group-based discrimination. The second thing about the word race, remember also, which is very important for our discussion today, is the word race means being in competition. See, they didn't pick house, tree, car. They said racism. Race means being where people are competing from here to there. And we are in competition. That's what racism means. Black people must learn how to compete or survive, or not compete and perish. And so this morning we're going to start talking about what we got to do. Now let's go back to when everybody said, where did this start? Let's go back to where it started. It all started in Africa. And as I go through all this, I want you all to keep some points. And I'll stick my finger up there. Remember those points. Those are the points going to be hurting us today. Those same points I'm going to articulate to you today. Now all this started in Africa. Let's say about 1441. There was a guy called Henry the Navigator who went around the coast of Africa and he found some slaves and traded some slaves off. And he brought them back to Europe. And he took them back to Europe and he gave them to the Pope as gifts. And the Pope in the Catholic Church was so beautifully appreciative of these slaves that he then said, since you've given me these slaves, what I'm going to do now is award you 300 miles of the coastline of West Africa, which is now called the Gold Coast. So Henry the Navigator was given land by the Pope, the Catholic Pope, and the Catholic Pope didn't even own the land. But he gave him all the rights of 300 miles of coastlines of West Africa. So it belongs to you. That was in 1441. And so and Henry the Navigator was a Portuguese. So he began to try to encourage other Portuguese to go around there and try to find some more slaves. So this is a good thing. We own all that land around there now. By 1487, the Pope then said, so many people began to pick up slaves. He says, what I'm going to do now is put out a public declaration and officially declare slavery to be a legitimate enterprise. And the Catholic Church was the first one to do it. Now, why is this important? Because you see, up until that point in time, slavery was never based on skin color. Slavery was based on three things to put you into slavery. One was an indebtedness, where you owed somebody something and not paid it off. Two was that you is through religious persecution. Or three, you were a prisoner of a war or conflict and you were now a captive and they were forcing you into labor. Those were the only three reasons you could get into slavery until the Catholic Church put out this declaration. And now they added a fourth variable which says color is now a factor. Now that's very important because the Catholic Church now had in previous slavery, in earlier parts of the century, let's say immediately after Christ was born, the Catholic Church played a very pivotal role in saying, as a religious institution, we got an obligation to represent those who were enslaved. And the Catholic Church set up a system that they would go through, whether it was a Greek slave or a Roman slave, they looked after the rights of the enslaved. Protect them, saying that even if you're a slave, there are certain things that people cannot do to you. The Catholic Church accepted that responsibility. Now, the Catholic Church now has condoned black enslavement based on skin color. That was totally different. But also, the first thing they did, they abandoned any interest in representing the interests of the enslaved. even though they've done it for everyone else. And all of a sudden, the problems begin to develop in Africa. Other religions begin to join in. So people say, well, Dr. Anderson, how are they able to enslave us? Because we were doing some things wrong in Africa. As the other religions joined in to start enslaving blacks, so did other nations, so did other ethnic groups. And black folk were totally ill prepared to deal with it, because we had been doing some things wrong in Africa ourselves. See, going back to about 765, the Muslims had been trying to get into Africa for the longest, because they'd heard about all the gold and silver and the wealth in Africa. And the Muslims had been going around, the Arabs had been going around Africa, trying to conduct holy wars against dark-skinned people to get access to the resources. And starting in 765, not 17, but in 765, the Arabs started enslaving black folk. They enslaved on an average of 1 million blacks every 100 years and shipped them out of Africa. So now if you start counting from 765 up to the present day, that's over 1,300 years. That means over 13 million blacks have been shipped out of Africa just by the Arabs alone. And the Arabs are still shipping blacks out of slavery. If you go to Ethiopia and Mauritania, you'll now find, in Sudan, you still find blacks being sold by Arabs for actually about $475 a piece. So Arabs have been selling blacks now for over 1,300 years. But when you get around the 900, though, 200 years after that, the Arabs are still trying to penetrate the blacks to get their wealth. And blacks have got an international reputation being one of the wealthiest nations on earth, talking about walking on streets of gold. And so from 900 up until about 1400, they lived reasonably well, because people were afraid to penetrate Africa. Because blacks also had a ferocious reputation for being invincible fighters. They were scared of the jungles and the black warriors. So no one went into Africa to get them, but the Arabs were still trying to get access to the wealth and resources. Now I'm back up to the 14th century again. Now in the 1400s, about the same time as I just told you that the Pope declared that officially that blacks can be enslaved, at the same time Timbuktu was invaded by the Arabs. They finally broke through. They broke through because, see, blacks at that time had three major empires: Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. They were the richest nation on earth, but the black leadership had set themselves up to be invaded by the Arabs and consented to be pimped. Because the black leadership was extremely naive, going around practicing what I call benign slavery. Every time anybody came into an African nation, like Mali, Songhai, and what they were saying is that, well, I'll do business with you, but you got to buy one of my slaves. And the slaves were their own people. And they were playing games with slavery, saying, well, it's a tribe, he's a different tribe, so I'll enslave him. But the slavery that blacks were practicing was not the same vicious kind of slavery that came later, but the fact that they were playing with it, condoning it, and willing to sell their own black folk out naively. Now the question becomes, why were they doing it? Okay, why were they doing it? They were doing it trying to impress people with their power, how strong they were, saying that I would do business with you, but let me show you how strong I am. I got 3 or 4 blacks in the back room, and you buy them from me, and then I'll sell you some gold and silver. And what people were impressed with was not really their power. They were impressed with the fact that you had absolutely no interest as a leader in your own people, and felt no responsibility to their welfare. And so when that got out, then all those countries, as I said, once the Pope condoned slavery, they began to flow into Africa, because they knew the black leadership did not feel the strong togetherness, the willingness to protect their own people and to look out for them and lead them, and would willingly sacrifice them. So Africa fell wide open. And people poured into Africa after the Pope declared slavery legal in the 1480s. By 1500, between 1500 and 1650, 150 years, they hauled out 5 million blacks just to Central America alone, just right south of here into Mexico and Central America, Costa Rica. Just to give you an example, after the Pope declared that you can legally go after those blacks, they pulled out 5 million of them and sent them in there. And those blacks, in 150 years, with sticks and stones, not steam shovels, but with sticks and stones and rocks dug out, over 16,000 tons of silver and 400 tons of gold just to enrich Spain and Portugal. And this was critically important because at that point in time, Africa was a rich continent, had all kinds of wealth. And Europe was an impoverished nation. Europe was run over with crime, sickness, disease, illness, disorganized. Africa was the glory of the world. But you see, our people were playing around, not looking out, taking care of the business of their people. And at that point in time, all these nations say, aha, we know how to strengthen Europe and rebuild Europe. And that's by displacing the wealth out of Africa and displacing not only the material wealth, but the human wealth of Africa. So they began to pour in and started sucking blacks out of Africa. Not only the black treasures, the gold, the silver, but also the human capital. In some areas, they almost depopulated parts of Africa by shipping blacks out. And over a course of about another 300 years, they shipped out somewhere between 25 and 35 million blacks. And out of all those blacks they shipped out of Africa, over 2/3 of them died en route trying to get here. As a matter of fact, from the 1500s to 1800s, 6 out of every 7 people that were shipped came across the Atlantic Ocean were black folk. 6 out of 7 were blacks. And they were depopulating Africa, not only as wealth, as resources, but as human capital. Very important. And as they came and as they shipped them out, everybody began to become enriched. But you still had black leadership that still didn't understand, unwittingly was playing into the hands of people who were much more serious about the games than they were. So I jump up to the year 1619. They brought in 20 blacks into America, formally, even though we'd had another group of blacks in here around in the 1500s. They've been floating around too off the PD River in South Carolina. And we'd had blacks much earlier, the Folsom people. But let me even get into that. But by 1619, they brought in 21 blacks into Jamestown, formally. And those blacks came in as indentured servants. They were traded by a German warship for supplies. Those blacks were free in about the year 1624. But something very important happened right before 1624. In 1621, you had a black guy named Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson came to the United States in 1621. Came in from England as a free black. At the same time, you had those other 20 black slaves brought in here in 1619, the first 20 blacks. But this black came in as a free black in 1621. He came in, and then since he was coming in from England, not from Africa, he then declared himself a free black, declared that he wanted head rights. And head rights in those days says that anybody that comes to the country can get 640 acres free right off the bat. Then plus you can get another 500-600 acres for every slave that you own. He immediately went and had 13 blacks. He brought in then, we got him 13 black slaves. He's black. So within a few years, about 15 years, he was one of the richest blacks in the colonies. But he was enslaving his own people. Now, going up to 1638, Maryland colony then put out a public edict that laid the cornerstone for racism in this country, saying that now that black folk coming into this country and they began to intermingle with whites and socialize like Johnson and trying to integrate, we ought to pass a new law. So the state of Maryland put out a law called Doctrine of Exclusion. The Doctrine of Exclusion says that no black shall be permitted to enjoy the fruits of white society. That was in 1638. Now Johnson still had it. He's really built up his land now. He had all kinds of land and a whole bunch of slaves, getting close to about 70, 80 slaves now. And a white guy went over to one of his plantations. And one of the black slaves there, named John Castor, asked him, says, why am I a slave here with this guy? He says, I didn't know that. He says he owns me for life. How does he own me for life? And the white fellow who was a plantation owner also said, look, he doesn't own you for life. You know, didn't you contract for indentured servantship? Indentured servantship normally runs 5 or 7 years. What do you mean he's got you for life? This black guy said, I've been working for this Anthony Johnson, this black slave plantation owner, for almost 27 years. The guy said, well, just run off and leave. Forget about him. You don't have to keep working for him. So the black slave, John Castor, ran off. But guess what happened? Anthony Johnson then went to court, and he sued the white plantation owner who had encouraged the black to run off. Sued him in court, and the court accepted Anthony Johnson's claim against this black slave, saying that he owned that slave for life. Now, what happened there never had ever happened on the history of the earth with black folk and in this country, where all of a sudden a person laid claims against the individual for the rest of his entire naked life. And it was a black man. And once that court decision was made, whites picked it up and said, aha. So by 1665, all the states then started passing enslavement laws. They went back and took the doctrine of exclusion and say, now, the doctrine of exclusion with Maryland says that black folks shall always be excluded and never be permitted to enjoy the fruits of white society. But after listening to the court decision for Anthony Johnson, we got a good thing going now. So they took that same doctrine and expanded it. And now the doctrine says that not only should black folks be excluded, subordinated, non-compensated, non-competitive managed workforce for the personal confidence and wealth building of white society. That became the enslavement codes, both explicitly and implicitly. And all the states began to enact it then, based on Anthony Johnson's ruling in court that he owns another black person for life. Now the system picks up. We jump now to about 1704. 1704, there's a black kid. There are a whole bunch of slaves coming in from Africa on a slave vessel called the Eagle. The Eagle is heading towards America. There's a young black boy on there, along with some other older slaves. The slaves decide to revolt on the ship. And they took over and knocked the captain down, took over the ship, and took the weapons, and we're going to fight to take over the control of the ship and head it back towards Africa. And as one of the older slaves grabbed a machete, and he said he's going to kill the captain so they can completely have control of the ship. As he swung at the captain, a young black slave jumped up and got in there and protected the captain and took the blows himself, which chopped off one of his arms